Good morning friends, welcome to the live lecture session of CEC. Today in the continuation of business ethics and CSR series, we'll be talking on the topic corporate governance in Indian scenario, its needs and importance. And for discussion on this topic with us we have Dr. Namita Rajput, who is principal in Shri Aurobindo Evening College, University of Delhi. So he'll be giving you the important views of hers on this lecture. So without wasting much time, I would request ma'am to please give her views on the lecture. Welcome ma'am.
Good morning friends. The topic of today is corporate governance, the Indian scenario, need and importance. The corporate governance as a means of achieving the equitable prosperity for the people of all the various, and nowadays it has come to the center stage because of the two reasons. One, after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War in 1990, it has become the conventional wisdom all over the world that the market dynamics must prevail in the corporate matters. The concept of governance, controlling and commanding heights of the economy has been given up as being unproductive. This turn has made the market the most decisive factor in setting the economic issues. Secondly, it has also coincided with the trust given to the globalization because of the establishment and administration of the World Trade Organization and the member nations of WTO, that is the World Trading Organization, trying to bring down the tall barriers. The globalization involves free movement of the four economic factors of the production, namely physical capital in terms of plant and machinery, financial capital in terms of money invested in the capital markets, or the foreign direct investment, that is FDI, the technology and the labor moving across the national borders. The pace of the movement of the financial capital has become quicker because of the private impact of information technology and the world having shrunk into a global village. When the investments take place in the emerging markets, investors want to be sure that not only the capital markets or the enterprises in which they live are run completely or not and competently or not, but they also have a good corporate governance. Corporate governance represents the value framework, the ethical framework, and the moral framework under which the overall business decisions taken place. In other words, the investments take place across the national borders. The investors wants to be sure that not only their own capital handled effectively and adds to the creation of the wealth, but the business decisions are also taken in the manner which is not illegal or involve the market hazards. Now, coming on to a very important question, why is the corporate governance important? Yes, there is a question in the back end of all the students that why the corporate governance is gaining importance specifically in the Indian scenario and the global village, that is the world is shrunk into a very small world and which is connected through the networks of networks which is called internet. The corporate governance is important for the society due to many reasons. First, it lays down the framework for creating long-term trust between the companies and the external providers of the capital. It improves the strategic thinking at the top by inducting the independent directors who bring a wealth of experience and a lot of new ideas. It rationalizes the management and the monitoring of the risk of firm free globally. It limits the liability of the top management and the directors by carefully articulating the decision-making process. It ensures the integrity of the financial reports. It helps to provide a degree of confidence that is necessary for the proper funding of the market economy. Now, why it is important in India? The need of the corporate governance in India. If the corporate governance has to take root in the country, it will to a large extent depend upon the economic and the business environment that has been created by the public grievance in the country. There cannot be a good corporate governance if the public governance is weak. And of course, the dramatic leela of the corporate like Enron has highlighted the reality of how the companies which were the darlings of the stock market and held up the models of the vigorous and the innovative growth can ultimately fall like a pack of the cards when the fraud and the overall dishonesty becomes the operational guide. So you have to be very careful in terms of your terms of reference which you take, the way you perform your work, and it should not be unethical, because we have one fine example of Enron who has really fallen like a pack of cards. So it is giving a big lessons to the Indian scenario companies. Now, the association of the players, the accounting firms, the Anderson has also raised a doubt about regarded the global play credibility of highly the had context. The need for the corporate governance has been highlighted because of the series of the scams that has really taken place and become the annual feature ever since the governance liberalization of the economy way back in 1991. Since then, there has been a lot of scams like Harshad Mehta scam, Ketan Parekh scam, the UTI scam, and there are so many other companies which are involved into this, and so on and so forth. In the Indian corporate governance, since it is very clear and loud that the overall, unless we induct the global governance standards, the scope of the scams may rise in the coming years to come. So this is a big lesson for us that we have to give a stop to all these practices, unethical practices, which is definitely giving a wrong name to the Indian companies. It has really shown, the losses in the Indian stock market, and overall there is a reduction in the reputation, and the overall framework, the ethical framework, has gone down. The one thing which is highlighted is that they are all for greed and money. So their greed is increasing, their substantial profits are also increasing, but eventually such companies which are not following the ethical framework may fall down. To reduce it to the minimum levels, there is an urgent need to improve the corporate governance in the country. The legal and the administrative environment in India provides a greater scope for the corporates in the business. There are for many more than the 5 decades since the independence, the lack of transparency, the financial disclosures, the corruption and the mismanagement have been accepted as a way of life, taken in the strike in the the overall initiated and hence hidden and non-competitive economic environment. As a result, unless a management is committed to be honest and observes the principles of the prosperity, the property, the atmosphere, it is too tempting not to otherwise have a good corporate governance in practice. We should approach the overall corporate governance in India not merely from the overall point of view of the Companies Act or the SEBI guidelines or the codes involved out of the recommendations of the committees such as Kumar Mangalam Birla Committee, the Rahul Bajaj Committee, but took at the entire network of various rules and regulations impinging on the business so that there is an integrated holistic system created for ensuring that the transparency and the good corporate governance prevails. So no discussions on the public affairs will be completed without a reference to the ethics and values. So overall, if you see the Indian scenarios, there has been a series of scams, and they are the big lessons for the Indian corporate governance in practice, that if you follow the unethical practices, the wrong code of conduct, and eventually the markets are going to suffer, the corporates are going to really suffer just for these small time profits, they are going to lose the reputation, and overall if you follow these unethical practices, a complete game will be multiplied by 0. The quality of the corporate governance is definitely also determined by the manner in which the top management, particularly the board of directors, allocates the financial resources of the company between themselves and of course the other interested groups such as employees, customers, the governance, etc. The basic qualities invariably expected in this regard are 1. Trust, 2. Honesty, 3. Integrity, 4th. Transparency, and the compliance with the law of the land. If you follow the framework of these qualities, of course, the profits, substantial profits, the future potentials of such companies would be very high. And of course, there are a lot of empirical evidences to this effect, and there we are not talking in air, we are talking with the good substance in view, and lot of empirical evidences are there to support this kind of a statement that if the people they are associated with the corporates, if they are trust, they are honest, they are loyal, they are in following the integrity, they are transparent in their approach, and they are following the law of the land, of course the game will be yours. But yes, if you do not follow this, on the vice versa, in the contrary context to this, what you have to face is a fall, and you will fall like a Titanic ship. There is an increasing body of the public opinions that would expect a business enterprises not only to be a mere economic unit, but also to be a good corporate citizens. For this, in the corporate governance must be based on the genuine respect for the business ethics and the values. But unfortunately, the business environment, if you talk about in India, is replete with the unethical situations such as the bribery, corruption, insider trading, malpractices of the various kinds, etc. Now, for example, the insiders, they do not think foul of the symphonies of the frauds and out legitimately to be belonging to the outsiders and the stakeholders. However, it is heartening to note that the things are slowly moving for a better, mainly because of the opening of the economy to the global players. Now, when you talk about the Indian companies in the yesteryears and the Indian companies in the liberalized framework, altogether the game has changed. Earlier, there were lot of malpractices, lot of problems. Insider trading acts were on the rise. But yes, after the liberalization, still the things are slowly moving. But yes, we are moving towards the open economy, where to do the frauds is actually becoming highlighted, and we have lot of social media in which these things will be highlighted. So people are a little scared of following any kind of malpractices of this kind. And of course, there's a game changer when you talk about the unethical practices in the social arena, present arena is concerned. The ethical climate in any business or the capital market depends upon mainly 3 factors. 1. Individual sense of the value. 2. The social value accepted by the business and industry. And when the overall Harshad Mehta scam took place, it was claimed that the manner in which the bank, the receipts were being treated was in the prevailing norms. Perhaps a similar argument would have been given to the Ketan Parikh scam. In other words, the practices which are later on the found to be highly objectionable because that is prevailing the market practices. Now coming on to the social values. The social values will depend upon the standards set up by the professional bodies such as the Institute of Chartered Accountancy of India or the Institute of Cost and Work Accounts in India, and so on. The third and perhaps the most decisive factor in the system. It is here we face the main challenge. Now, facing of the main challenges concerned, our market encourages the lack of the corporate governance. There is so much of a shortfall, so much of a problem as far as the corporate governance practices is concerned, and this is the main focus and the main center for challenges. Now, if those who violate the norms are efficiently and effectively taken care of, they are effectively punished, then the fear of the punishment will make the violators adhere to the principles of the corporate governance. What we lack in India today, which comes in the way of the corporate governance, is presumption that the violators may not be detected, and even if detected, they could go scot-free with their, the wrongdoings. And if we want to, the usher in an area of better corporate governance in the country, the focus has to be turned effectively on creating a proper climate of the public governance and making the changes in the various regulations and imbibing on the working of the enterprises, the body of the capital market. Now, the Companies Act, the harbinger of the corporate governance. Now, basically, these are the framework under which the corporate, the companies are governed. And of course, we would be coming and looking forward for some good ethical climate, a good code of conduct, which is definitely going to make the reputation of the company and taking the company to the great heights. Now, in India, until recently, the company legislations has been the main instrument to promote the corporate governance. That is, by passing the laws, by doing some kind of amendments, we are trying to drive the Indian corporate scenario. Now, tracing its origin to the mid-19th century, thereafter closely following the similar developments in United Kingdom and the Companies Act 1956, was a consolidating legislation with far-reaching impact, now significantly altered the structure of the corporate management in India. Now, subsequently, the incorporating recommendations of the Cadbury Committee, the Act legislated inter alia the abolitions of the systems of managing agents and institution that has served the country truly and the well-being during the early days of the corporations and more significantly industrialization. But if you take fallen into the disrepute through abuse and malpractices in its applications by the later date exponents. Now, with the precious vehicle of supplying of the corporate wealth for the benefit of few dominant, controlling shareholdings was sought to be destroyed, and subsequent amendments in the later part of the 20th century essentially built up the basic 1956 edifice and usually attempted to observe the loopholes practices. Now, a completely revised, updated and in tune with the times abridged version of the legislation was introduced in the Parliament some years ago, but more urgent and necessary revisions to meet the requirements of a changing business environment were enacted through the amendments in 1999. Another amendment bill introduced way back in late 1999 and modified in 2000 has already been approved by the Parliament. Now, this offers further inputs for improving the standards of the corporate governance in India. So, with the changing laws, with the changing amendments, with the modified framework, we are trying to uphold the spirit of the Indian corporate scenario by passing and incorporating, amending the Companies Act, because that is the basic essence for the corporate governance, and this is how we move towards improving the standards by introducing such amendments and introducing some new guidelines for the corporate governance in the country. Now, how the emergence of the corporate governance issues in India. The stock market of London appointed, as discussed earlier, the famous Cadbury Committee, which submitted its report way back in 1992. that included the code of the best practices to be practiced by the listed companies. Now, the passing of the best practices by the Cadbury's Committee has been a landmark in this direction. How it is a landmark? It overall convoluted every information together and came out with the guidelines, which were definitely called as the best practices code for the companies to follow, and of course by the listed companies. Sir Cadbury report was implemented in the London Stock Exchange as a part of the listing agreement with the member companies. And not only this, the Cadbury report is generally considered to be a foundation stone for the corporate governance to come. In India, the real history of the corporate governance dates back to the year 1992, following the efforts made in many countries of the world to put it in place, the system suggested by the Cadbury Committee. The Confederation of the Indian Industry framed a voluntary code of the corporate governance for the listed companies in 1998. This was followed by the recommendations of the Kumar Mangalam Birla Committee set up in 1999 by the SEBI, culminating the introduction of Clause 9 of the Standard Listing Agreement to be compiled with the listed companies in the stipulated phases. The Kumar Mangalam Birla Committee divided the recommendations into a mandatory and a non-mandatory framework. Now, when you talk about the mandatory framework has something to do with the essential reporting and the aspects which are not optional. But non-mandatory disclosures are something to do with the ethical practices, and if you go for the non-mandatory disclosures, it is going to add to the ethical reputation of the companies and for the years to come. So, overall, when you talk about the Mangalam Committee report, basically it has been divided in two types, one mandatory disclosures and two is a non-mandatory disclosures to this effect. The mandatory recommendations include such issues as the composition of the board, that is how the board of directors are going to be composed of, how they are appointed, how the structure of the audit committees would be, how the remuneration of the directors is going to be fixed, what are the board procedures for that matter, how the discussions and analysis would take place, how the annual report will be made, what are the particular sections to this report, how the disclosures of the directors, interest, shareholders, rights, compliance, the level of corporate governance is in the annual report. So, when you talk about the mandatory recommendations which was given by Kumar Mangalam Birla Committee in the Indian context, the overall mandatory framework is all about the appointment procedures, then the regulations to be followed, the bylaws, the analysis, the rights, the liabilities, the compliance, and everything in relation to the annual report is enlisted. Now, it is the non-mandatory recommendations included the issues concerning the chairman of the board, setting up of the remuneration committee, half-yearly information to the shareholders, the use of the postal ballots for certain late decisions, appointment of the nominee directors, and the obligations of the institutional directors. So, overall, what are the efforts to initiate the corporate governance in India? The Companies Act Amendment 2000 will be taken in the next session. So, let me give you a recap of what hurriedly we did in this session. We started with the concept of the corporate governance in India, and why it is important, because it gives you a framework for creating the long-term trust between the companies and the external providers of the capital. Now, see, the people who invest in the country, in the overall companies, they have to be very particular about where their funds are going, how the funds are being managed. So, they have to have a small kind of the framework, a trust, a pecuniary relationship which is mandatory for a company to develop with their external providers of the capital. So, corporate governance They are the bylaws, the rules, the regulations according to which the company would be governed. And of course, you have to be very particular about the ethical framework to be followed, and the long-term trust to be created, the modus operandi to make your ethical activities, the code of activities in relation to the best code of ethics. Then we talked about, it limits the liability of the top directors, management, by carefully articulating the decision making process. So, overall, if you want to have the confidence, from the people who are investing, you have to be very particular about the corporate governance practices which you have to follow, because it is deep rooted concern, and to a large extent it decides the fortune for the companies to follow. So, overall, the drastic corporations, because of the lot of scams which have taken place, like Enron, there are so much of Ketan Parikh scams which have taken, UTI scams, and of course there are so many other references to this effect, which is a very, very clear indication that we are not following what we are supposed to follow, and that is why every year there is some scam or the other which is coming up, and which is really bad for the Indian corporate scenario. So, the legal and administrative environment has to be under strict control, and we have to rope in so many wrong and the unethical practices if we want to make the corruption free India, and it is good for the Indian corporate sector also. Then for the decades to come, there is definitely a lack of transparency, lack of financial disclosures, corruption, mismanagement, which has to be taken care of very, very diligently. And of course, the overall corporate governance practices are there to take care of these things, and the management has to be very committed in this regard. You have to be very honest, you have to observe the principles, so that we are able to create an environment which is definitely very tempting for otherwise good and the corporate practices in practice. So, we should approach the issues of the corporate governance in India not merely from the point of view of the Companies Act or the SEBI, but we have to follow the guidelines and the codes involved as per the recommendations of the various committees such as Kumar Mangalam, Rahul Bajaj, but you have to take into account the entire networks of the various rules and the regulations which have been impinging the business, so that there is an integrated holistic system which is definitely created to create the best transparent and the good corporate governance practices to come. Now, overall, when you talk about the other aspects, that when you talk about the Indian environment definitely is having a lot of intransparent structure. Every time we talk about the bribery, corruption, trading malpractices, so it has to be controlled, glitched, and this is very disheartening to note that slowly we are moving towards it is heartening to know that we are definitely moving towards an open economy, and to do the unethical practices would definitely close your shops, and your business will become a Titanic in this regard. So, overall, the Companies Act is one instrument taking into which or owing to which we are moving towards the high corporate governance practices in India. So, in the coming session, we will be talking about the emergence of the corporate governance issues in India. I hope the session would be beneficial for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for this informative session. Dear friends, for any queries regarding this ongoing session, you can call us on our toll-free number, and that is 1800-110-430. We will be continuing this lecture after a short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back, friends. We'll continue with our ongoing lecture. So let's start it.
So in this session, we have some more important information to share, the emergence of the corporate governance issues in India. Now, this is a very important topic for the students because they have to incorporate these issues when they are studying, and they have to make certain good amendments in this regard. The Kumar Mangalam Birla Committee is a landmark in this regard. It divides its recommendations in basically two major parts: mandatory disclosures and non-mandatory disclosures. Mandatory recommendations included issues as the composition of the board, appointment and the structure of audit committees, remuneration of the directors, board procedures, additional information regarding the management, discussions and the analysis as a part of the annual report, disclosures of the directors' interest, shareholders' rights and the compliance level of the corporate governance in the annual report. Now, when you talk about the non-mandatory disclosures included the issues concerning the chairman of the board, setting up of the remuneration committee, half-yearly information to the shareholders, and of course, the postal ballots of certain laying decisions, appointment of nominee directors, obligations of the institutional shareholders. So now, what are the efforts to initiate the corporate governance in the country? So we would be talking on the Companies Amendment Act 2000. Many provisions are definitely relating to the corporate governance, such as additional ground of disqualifications of directors in certain cases, setting up of the audit committees, directors, responsible statements of the directors' reports, etc., and basically the introduction of the Companies Act 2000. The corporate governance were also introspected in the year way back in 2001 by the advisory group constituted by the Standing Committee on International Finance Standards and the Codes of the Reserve Bank of India under the chairmanship of Y.V. Reddy, the Deputy Governor. The Enron debacle way back in 2001 involving the land of glove, relationship between the auditor, the corporate client, the scam involving the fall of the corporate giants in the US like WorldCom, Quest, Global Crossing, Xerox, and the consequent enactment of the stringent Sabins-Oxley Act and are some important. The factors which prompted the Indian government to be somewhat to put into place the proper governance then mechanism in the structure and the system of the administration of the listed public and the limited companies. In the year 2000, we are now talking about the Naresh Chandra Committee, which was formed in 2002. In the year 2002, a high-level committee was appointed to examine and recommend the drastic amendments to the law involving the auditor-client relationships and the role of dependent directors by the Department of Company Affairs in the Ministry of Finance and the Company Affairs under the chairmanship of Naresh Chandra. The committee was asked to examine the various corporate governance issues and to recommend the end changes in the diverse research as the statutory auditor committee relationship, so that to further strengthen the professional nature of the interface, number one, the need, if any, for the rotation of statutory and the firms or the partners, number three, the procedure for appointment of auditors and the determination of the audit fees, the restrictions, if any, on non-audit functions. Naresh Chandra Committee in 2002 gave the following aspects also. The fifth is independence of auditing functions. The sixth is, the measures which are importantly required to ensure that the management and the company actually present a true and a fair statement of the financial affairs of the companies. The next is the need to, consider the measures such as certification of accounts and the financial statements by management and directors. And the next is the necessity of having a transparent system of random scrutiny of the audited accounts, the adequacy of regulations of the chartered accountancy, the company secretaries and the other similar ones. The advantage, if any, of setting up of an independent regulator similar to the Public Company Account Oversight Board in the SOX Act, and if so, if constitution and the role of the independent directors and how their independence and effectiveness can be ensured. Now we are moving on to a again very important committee called Narayan Murthy way back in 2003. The company's law amendment bill, which was passed in the year 2003, envisaged many amendments on the basis of the reports of the Naresh Chandra Committee and absolutely appointed Narayan Murthy Committee. Both the countries' committees have gone an extremely important job to promote the corporate governance practices in India. Narayan Murthy Committee report summed up the utility of the corporate governance in following: the effectiveness of a system of the corporate governance cannot be legislated by the law, nor can any system of the corporate governance be by the state. In a dynamic environment, the system of the corporate governance needs to be continuously evolved. The committee believes that the recommendations raises the standards of the corporate governance in India firms and make them very attractive for the domestic and the global capitals. So these are the stepping stones which are definitely going to improve the standards of the Indian corporate scenario. Not only this, it is also going to improve the reputation aspect of the company. So these recommendations will also form to have the base for the further evolution of the structure of the corporate governance in consonance with the rapidly changing economic and industrial environment of the country in the new millennium. Now, coming on to the introduction of the corporate governance norms consequent to the debacles of the famous corporates was a very good augury for the corporate world. The stakeholders, financial institutions, bankers, creditors, stakeholders, and overall the general public and appreciated the measures taken by the SEBI and the Ministry of Commerce in the regulatory corporates. In the present global scenario, Indian corporate sector has not only to compete with the business worldwide, but also has to achieve the levels of the management and the governance there inspire confidence in investors both domestic and foreign. The legal and the regulatory framework must provide a comfort to the investors, especially the foreign investors. Now, keeping this in view, the Department of the Companies Affairs, that is DCA, has really taken several initiatives in the recent past. These include legitimate changes, modernization of the services, which is definitely going to help the technology. The DCA, that is the Department of the Company Affairs, in consultation with the experts in the field, as also the stakeholders, has ushered in the several changes in the corporate law. Now, what are those changes? We will be now talking on the legislative changes which are most important. The Companies Act 1956 has been amended thrice since 1999. Some further amendments are under the consideration to give effect to the policy liberalization. An ordinance was promulgated on 23rd October 2001 for the easier terms and conditions for buyback of the shares by the companies. This was done by keeping in view the continuing depression in the share market and also the recent developments the US and elsewhere. The government constituted a high level committee to examine and make the recommendations for the legislative framework to enable the formation and conversion of the corporate business into companies. Now, based on the recommendations of this committee, a bill was introduced in the Lok Sabha in the year August 2001 and passed by both the houses of parliament in December 2002. Now, coming on to the legislative, intended to provide the primary producers an option to have a better kind of business organization called a producer company, to produce and market the products in the modern and professional manner at par with the other companies. Now, it may enhance the efficiency and the competitiveness in the present liberalized and the globalized market and help for the betterment of the primary producer. Further, the government constituted a committee to examine the existing law relating to winding up of the company in order to remodel it in the line with the latest developments and innovations in the corporate law and the corporate elsewhere. Now, on the basis of the recommendations of the committee, a bill was introduced in the Lok Sabha in the year August 2001 and was passed by both the houses of parliament. Now, the bill under a new era of insolvency laws and provides for constitution of the Companies Law Tribunal. The jurisdiction and the power presently conferred in the Company Law Board will be viewed in the proper, the national tribunals. This will result in the dissolution of the Company Law Board, and if also envisages to replace the board for the industrial and financial, the reconstruction by repelling the SIC industries, that is the Special Provision Act 1985 for accelerating the pace of the revival. The governance initiates through a regulation law also to make significant basic articles in the country. The Securities and the Exchange Board of India has an ongoing program of reforming the primary and the secondary capital markets. The SEBI was to set up the government in 1992 to counter the overall shortcomings which were found in the functioning of the stock exchange, in as long as delays and the lack of transparency is in the procedures, vulnerability to provide the rigging and the insider trading, and to regulate the capital market. Now, introduction of certain regulations, continuing with the same. The Security Exchange Board of India has been made into a statutory body, basically to authorize, to regulate all the merchant banks and issue an activity, the guidelines, supervise and regulate the working of the mutual fund and oversee the working of the stock exchange in the country. In consultation with the government, SEBI has initiated a number of steps to introduce and improve the practices, greater transparency in the capital market in the interest of the investing public. The stock market in the country also mandates several, the statutory requirements, basically through their overall agreements that every publicly traded company has to comply with. Now, on the insistence of Security Exchange Board of India, the stock exchanges have amended the listing agreements to ensure that the listing companies furnishes their annual agreement, slowing the variations between the financial projections and the utilization of the frauds, which would enable the shareholders to make a comparison between the promises and the performance. According to the professions, the Institute of Chartered Accountancy of India has emerged as a responsible body for regulating the profession of public auditors and overall counts the many achievements of the issue of number of accounting and auditing standards. The constitution of an independent National Advisory Committee on Accounting Standards has been legislated. The amendment Companies Act of the year 1999. Now, continuing with the introduction of the regulations, the other professional bodies such as the Institute of Cost and Work Accountants of India, Institute of Company Secretaries of India have really helped in promoting and regulating a well trained, disciplined body of professionals who could add value to the corporations in improving the management practices. The Institute of the Company Secretaries of India have also taken a major initiative in constituting in the year 2001 the Secretarial Standard Board comprising the senior member of MBNs to formulate the secretarial. The standard and the best secretarial practices and develop the guidance notes in order to integrate, consolidate, harmonize, standardize the prevalent diverse practices with to overall ultimate objective of promoting a better corporate practices and improve the corporate governance. R. Ravi, the ICSI president, informed the press on 30th January 2005 that the institution has mooted a proposal to the government to make mandatory secretarial standards issued by it on the lines of the accounting standards issued by the Institute of the Chartered Accountancy of India. The ICSI has issued 3S till now on the board meetings, the general meetings and the payment of divided and on registered record being the finalized. As mentioned earlier, with the interest generated in the corporate sector by the Cadbury Committee report, the issues of the corporate governance was studied in depth and with the Confederation of the Indian Industry CII, Associate Chambers of Commerce that is SOCHM, and the Security Exchange Board of India that is SEBI. The Corporate Governance Code in India was first promoted by the Confederation of the Indian Industry. Further, the Security and Exchange Board of India constituted the Kumar Mangalam Birla Committee and adopted the report way back in mid-2000. The Kumar Mangalam Birla Committee confined itself to submitting the overall recommendations for good corporate governance and left it to SEBI to decide on the penalty provisions for the non-compliance. Now, in the absence of the suitable penalty provisions, it has been difficult for the market regulators to establish a good corporate governance. Some of the penalty provisions are not sufficient enough to discipline the corporates. For example, the penalty for non-compliance of the stipulated minimum of 50% in the respect of the number of directors in the board that should be non-executive directors is delisting of the shares of the company. This would hardly serve the purpose. Now, in fact, the whole of the detrimental to the interest of the investors and to the effective functioning of the capital market. Similarly, an audit report committee, which is the subvermin to the board, may serve no purpose at all. One which is in the perpetual conflict with the board may result in the salutants to the detriments of the company. Now, if the company is to function smoothly, it shall be made very clear that the findings of the recommendations of the audit committee needs to be necessary, have to be the accepted by the board, which is definitely accountable for the shareholders for the performance and under section 291 of the Companies Act is entitled to exercise all such powers and to do all such things in the company is authorized to exercise and do. However, some functional specialists are of considered view that whenever there is a difference in the opinion and audit committee advice is ignored or overruled, the board should be required to place the facts before the general body of the shareholders meetings. Now, we are coming on to the implementation of the recommendation of the Birla Committee report. Clause 49, the most important clause for the listing agreement. What is clause 49, which is largely talked about? The Security Exchange Board of India monitors, regulates the corporate governance of the listed companies in India through Clause 9.2, the clause incorporated in the listing agreement, that is LA, of the stock exchanges with the companies, and it is to be compulsorily for them to comply with the provisions. Stock exchange endeavors to bring in the corporate governance standards among the companies by the introduction of Clause 49 in the listing agreement they enter into with them before they are being listed. SEBI issued Clause 49 in the February 2000. All the groups, the companies had to comply with the provisions by 31st March 2001. All other listed companies with the annual minimum paid up capital of INR 10 crores, the net worth of INR 25 crores had to comply with the provisions of 31st March 2002, and the remaining listed companies with a minimum paid up capital of INR 3 crores or the net worth of INR 25 crores had to comply with then by the March 2003. Subsequently, on 29th October 2004, the SEBI amended the original Clause 49 and issued a new 49 clause. All the existing listed companies will have to comply with the provisions of the newly clause by 1st April 2005. However, it has already come into force from the companies that have been listed on the stock exchange after 29th October 2004. Now, the provisions and the requirement under Clause 49.1, the composition of the board. The board should be composed of the following manner. In case of the full-time chairman, 50% of non-executive directors and 50% of executive directors. 2. Constitution of the audit committee. The audit committee should have the independent with the chairman having some financial background. The finance director and the head of the internal and audit should be special invitee, and the minimum of 3 meetings should be convened every year. The audit committee is responsible for review of the financial performance on half-year, annual basis, appointment, removal, remuneration of auditors, review of internal control system and its adequacy, remuneration of directors, of non-executive directors to be decided by the board. Details of the remuneration package, stock options, performance initiatives of the directors should be disclosed to the shareholders. Now, coming on to the board procedures, the board should have at least 4 meetings in a year. The director should be minimum of more than 10 committees and the chairman of more than 5 committees across companies. The management decisions and the analysis report should be including of the following parts. 1. Industry structure and developments. 2. Opportunities and the threats. 3. The segment-wise or the product-wise performance, the outlook of the business, the risk and the concerns, internal control systems and its adequacy, discussions of the financial performance, and lastly, the disclosure by the directors, material, financial and the commercial transactions with the company. The next is the shareholder information. The company should provide a brief resume of the new and the reappointed directors, and the quarterly results should be submitted to the stock exchange placed in the company website and pertaining to it. The shareholder investment grievance committee should have a minimum of 2 meetings a year under the chairmanship of independent directors, report on the corporate governance, and a certificate from the auditors on the compliance of the provisions of the corporate governance as per Clause 49 in the listing agreement should be provided. The new Clause 49 lays down tighter qualifications criteria for independent directors. Unlike the original clause, the new clause disqualifies the material suppliers and the customer from being independent directors. It may also disallows the shareholders with more than 2% stake in the company from being an independent director, as well as the former executive who left the company unless the 3 years ago. The partners of the current legal audit. and of course the consulting firms as well as the partners of such firms that had worked into the company in the preceding 3 years too could not have been an independent director. The relative of a promoter, an executive director, a senior executive one level below the executive director too cannot be an independent director. Another important difference is that while the original clause gave a board a freedom to decide whether materially significant relationship between a director and a company affected his independence, the new clause takes into account the discretionary powers, the overall, the power away from the board. According to the original clause, minimum gap of at least 2 board meetings could be a minimum of 4 months. The new clause has also reduced the time gap to 3 months. Original clause has stipulated that the audit committee must meet at 3 times in a year and at least once in every 6 months. The new clause makes a mandatory for the audit committee to meet a minimum of 4 times in a year with a minimum time gap of 4 months. Moreover, the original clause which was silent on the qualifications of the audit committee members, the new clause states that all the members should be financially literate and at least one should have the financial and accounting management expertise also. The new clause gives a definition: financial literate and accounting go relationship financial management expertise. Now, what are the differences in the key positions of the original clause and the new clause? The new clause may also strengthen and widens the role and the responsibility of the audit committee. So that means the audit committee has been made more stronger and wider. The nominee directors considered to be independent directors. The nominee of institution that has been invested in or left to the company are deemed and independent directors. New provisions incorporated in the new clause 49. The major new provisions included in the new clause 49 are given below. 1. The board will lay down the code of conduct for all the board members and the senior management of the company to follow. The CEO and a CFO will certify the financial statements and the cash flows statement of the company, and at least one independent director of the holding company will have a member of the board and the material non-listed company. The audit committee of the listed company shall review the financial statements of unlisted subsidiary, in particular of the investments. If while preparing the financial statements of the company follow a treatment that is different from the prescribed in the accounting standards, it may be disclosed that the financial statements and the management should also provide an explanation of doing so if they are following a diverse matter. And of course, it should be inspired by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act clause 49 of the listing agreement, which was scheduled to come in effect from 1st of April 2005. However, the bowing to a general demand from the corporates, the SEBI declared its board meet on the 23rd of March to 2005 to defer the implementation of clause 49 till December to provide listing entities including the public sector no special concessions to be included to the pre-owned enterprises, and SEBI also felt that PSUs are also not to be looked upon as a special case of the companies. Now, overall, when you talk about the CEO's accounting for the company's risk systems, under the new provisions, the chief executive officers and the chief financial officers in the country are preparing for the litmus test. Being 31st December 2005, all CEOs and CFOs embarked on the massive documentations to meet the requirement of clause 49 of SEBI listing agreement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for this informative lecture of yours. I am sure, friends, this lecture must have added your knowledge to the business ethics and CSR. We will be having such informative sessions again in future. So, stay connected with us on CEC Live Lecture Series. Thank you.